Okay, so I'll move on to IgA nephropathy studies. And I think, as John mentioned, it would be safe to say that about 10 to 15 years ago, there wasn't a huge amount of interest in doing clinical trials in IgA nephropathy. And I think the reasons are because that it is a fairly rare condition, as we can see, and the condition tends to progress fairly slowly as well over kind of years to 10, 15 years. And so it takes a lot of effort to do these studies, and and the studies I'll talk about are taking place over several different countries in order to get the kind of numbers required to find any findings. But there has been a real change over the past kind of 5 to 10 years, and these are the number of studies that have now been published and reported on globally within the last 5 years, and I'll take you through some of these very briefly. So just to go through how IgA nephropathy develops, I think we talked about it this morning, but we have here a cartoon of your antibody-producing cells producing the IgA that is subtly different in IgA nephropathy, that then goes on to form immune complexes that travel in the bloodstream and then deposit within the kidney. That causes the damage in terms of causing inflammation, scarring, and damage to kidney function. So we can target this in different ways, and many of you would have heard of steroid therapy, and some of you would have perhaps been on steroids as well. So there's been a number of clinical trials and interest in steroids, both as a way of kind of dampening down antibody production and to try and dampen down that inflammation. And it's important to note, I think, that obviously I'll talk about the studies, but individual circumstances might vary about why certain people have been put onto steroids, so these findings won't necessarily apply. But this was one of the big studies from Germany that compared intensive supportive care, so really focusing on blood pressure control, lifestyle measures, salt reduction, smoking, stopping smoking, exercise, plus compared to adding in medications to suppress the immune system, which included steroids. And the finding from this study, the bottom line, was that the addition of drugs to suppress the immune system that included steroids did not significantly improve the outcome. And more side effects, including kind of serious infections, were observed amongst the patients who received the medications to suppress the immune system. But it's really important to note from this study that after so everybody received this kind of intensive, what they call intensive supportive care, so focusing on blood pressure, lifestyle measures, etc., at the start of the study. And when they did that, about a third of patients responded to these measures and didn't actually, and improved and didn't actually follow through into the main study. This is another steroid study looking at the effect of methylprednisolone, another form of steroids, in patients with IgA nephropathy. It took place in Asia and Australia. This study was using, I think, far higher doses of steroids than might be used in here or in the US. But the bottom line for this study was that the study had to be stopped early because of an increased risk of serious adverse events, especially infections, and some of those were serious, and there were actually 2 deaths in the patient group receiving steroids. Although there was potential benefit in terms of in terms of the kidney outcomes also. So they're now repeating this study using a lower dose of the steroid, and we'll wait to see what those results show. So that's the testing study. But what's been very interesting over the last few years is now targeted therapies. So John talked about this morning as well. So there's this form of steroid called Nefecon, which is a targeted released budesonide, which is just released in the kind of part of the small bowel, which contains a lot of these immune cells that generate the IgA. And here we've got a picture of that Nefecon and a picture of where it is active. And the interesting thing about this drug and how it's kind of formulated is it's designed to be released there, and it's designed to undergo breakdown in the liver, so it doesn't really enter into the circulation. And the idea is that hopefully this would reduce some of the side effects associated with steroids. And this was a shorter phase 2 study. So if you remember the kind of earlier on study, but in this study they found that 9 months of treatment reduced the level of protein leak, which is associated with reducing the risk of future kidney damage. So this study is now in a phase 3 study called the NefIgArd study. That's open within the UK. It's going to look at Nefecon for 9 months and look at long-term outcome to see if that reduction in protein leak can be replicated in a larger group of people, or whether it leads to beneficial outcomes in kidney function as well. Okay, and that's recruiting in several different countries, including UK and many centres, and I know Glasgow is one centre for this study. Okay, what about the antibody-producing cells, the B cells themselves? So there is clearly interest in looking at these cells as the source of IgA. This was a small study done looking at a drug called rituximab. Some of you might have heard of this medication. It's been used now quite widely in other conditions like vasculitis, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis. But there was no benefit in this study in IgA nephropathy. And it might be that this drug didn't actually affect the specific cells that produce that subtly abnormal IgA in IgA nephropathy. So there's other drugs that are being tested in this condition. 2 of these studies have completed now, the blisibimod study, the BRIGHT-SC study, and the tachycept study. And we'll wait to see what results come from those studies. Okay, and finally, looking at the kidney itself and how we can intervene when the IgA gets stuck on these filters and causes the inflammatory damage. So I'm going to mention another phase 3 study now called the PROTECT study. So this is a study of sparsentan, which is a new drug in its class of a combination angiotensin receptor blocker, so the ARB, the sartan, with what's known as an endothelin receptor blocker. And this drug has shown to be had a positive effect in a phase 2 study in another kidney condition called FSGS, or focal segmental glomerulosclerosis. And the idea with this drug is that it has potential beneficial effects on different kidney cell types, including the kidneys, the cell types that surround the filters, and the cell types within the kidney as well. So this is a big phase 3 study. I think they're looking to recruit around 300 patients globally. Again, it's open in Glasgow and in other centres in the UK, including Leicester. This study will be of taking this medication for 2 years versus the active control, which is another sartan, and to look to see if this produces beneficial outcomes. So that was sparsentan. So when after IgA deposits on the filters, then we know that a kind of the immune system can react to that, and there's part of the immune system called the complement system, which reacts to that IgA being stuck on, and that can cause a cycle of increasing inflammation and scarring in the kidney as well. And there's a new drug trial that's just opened in Leicester and is open in other countries as well, called a drug studying the effects of a drug called cemdisiran. This is a phase 2 study. We've talked at lunchtime. I think there's somebody into this study already from the UK. And this is using a new technique to do with gene silencing to knock down production of one of these complement components with the idea of reducing that kind of complement cycling and the inflammatory process. So that's quite a new novel way of using therapies that target genes to try and reduce that process. There's a lot of interest in the complement system and how that's overactive in IgA nephropathy, and there's a lot of other different complement inhibitors which are coming soon to trials. And after the IgA nephropathy, after the IgA deposits in the kidney, there are other kind of inflammatory processes that get increased. One of the pathways which we were very interested in was the spleen tyrosine kinase pathway, or SYK for short. And I don't, if for those of you that have been to previous talks, Fred Tam talked about the use of the inhibitor fostamatinib, or the SIGN study, and that's now completed, and we're waiting for the results from that. Okay, so that's probably all I was going to talk about specific studies. So I was going to take a step back and just mention why you might want to take part in a clinical trial. Well, I think without clinical trials, we would never improve our understanding of the condition, and things would never move forwards. So we're very extremely grateful to people with the condition giving up their time to put themselves forwards for these studies. You might want to access a new treatment that's not available, and many of these studies will have a phase where after you complete the first part of the study, where you might be randomized to either getting the new treatment or the placebo, where they'll do a second phase, which is called an open label phase, where everybody will get access to that new treatment. But by the nature of it, because it's a study, because it's a trial, we don't really know for certain whether they're going to have long-term benefits. That's the purpose, clearly, of doing the study. But I think some people say to me that it's nice to actually take some ownership as well and take an active role in their disease process. And there are clearly drawbacks to taking part in clinical trials. Certainly, they can be very time-consuming, especially some of the earlier phase studies. But we try and schedule kind of study visits around patients, really, and often we can combine clinic visits with study visits as well. There might be side effects from additional medications. And as I mentioned before, we often don't know what the long-term effects are, but often by the time these medications come to phase 2 and phase 3 studies, they've already been through several years of safety studies. Generally, these trials, I would say, are not suitable for those with reduced kidney function because most of them are being used in people with more preserved kidney function, as that's perhaps where you would see the most benefit. Also, people with extremely kind of, very slowly progressive disease may not be eligible for these studies as well, because it might be that any additional kind of trial medication would not make any difference anyway. A lot of these studies have a kind of EGFR cutoff for entry, and usually that's set around the 30 mark, but each trial will differ for that. These studies that I mentioned are not suitable for those on dialysis, and there's no, as far as I'm aware, there's no studies available at the moment for those who've had a kidney transplant to look at how we treat patients who have IgA that recurs in the transplant, although that's clearly a very an area that needs to be studied. How do you find out more? So I would say to contact your own your kidney units, your kidney doctors. But I'll point out some websites that I think are pretty useful as well, and I'll show you examples of those. You can contact either myself or John, who's really been involved very heavily in the design of many of these global studies. Those are email addresses or Twitters. So the first website, the UK Clinical Trials Gateway. So if you just Googled that, you'd get to this website, and here you can kind of search for a study, so for the condition and where you are. And I did this a couple of days ago, so I put in IgA nephropathy and Glasgow there, and I found the NephGuard study at the top and the Sparcent and the Protect study there. And you can click into those and find out a bit more detail about the individual study, the kind of if you're eligible, the rationale, and so on. And I would also point out that many of these studies now have got really good websites as well that you can find out more about each individual trial. This is the NephCure website, which I think was developed in the US, but is now kind of being rolled out more globally now. And again, you can put in your postcode and what you're interested in. And here I put in the postcode for this hotel, and it brought up the Protect study as well. So that's the NephCure website. And this is an American website called clinicaltrials.gov, but all studies have to be registered through this. So this is quite a comprehensive website as well. And again, I put in IgA nephropathy and Glasgow, and then got a number of hits about both completed and recruiting studies, and then you can filter through and find out more. And clinicaltrials.gov it gives you a quite interesting map view as well, which tells you about the number of studies going on in IgA nephropathy in the world. And these are the numbers of recruiting studies. So you can see 7 in Europe, 8 in the US, and 12 in China. So as we said before, IgA nephropathy seems to be more common in China and Asia, and there's a lot of interest in research in those countries as well. So I'll flash up these details again. And this is our clinical research trials team in Leicester over when the weather was a bit better this summer. So thank you for listening.